If it's Tuesday, Israeli officials prepare for a series of high-stakes meetings on the future of Gaza as fighting intensifies on multiple fronts, with strikes killing at least 3 Hamas officials in Lebanon. Plus, the death toll from the earthquakes in Japan rises to more than 50 people, and an investigation is now underway into a fatal aircraft collision that saw a passenger jet erupt into flames after crashing into a Coast Guard plane on a relief mission. And America's broken border pushes U.S. cities to the brink as mayors face an unprecedented wave of migrant arrivals and limited resources to respond to the crisis after another record month of migrant encounters on the southern border. Welcome to Meet the Press Now. I'm Garrett Hake reporting in Washington, where President Biden is set to return tonight, and waiting for him at home in the new year, the reality of a contentious 2024 election year ahead, an impeachment inquiry, an emergency funding battle over the border, and U.S. national security priorities, all amid an escalating war in the Middle East. Which is where we begin, as Israeli officials lay out a new strategy for Gaza, and a senior Hamas official has been killed by strikes in Lebanon. According to Hamas officials, the explosion killed at least 3 officials, and the Lebanese prime minister is accusing Israel of trying to bring Lebanon into the war. The IDF hasn't commented, with a senior advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu telling NBC earlier today that Israel is not claiming responsibility.
Obviously, in Lebanon, there are many Hezbollah targets, but whoever did this strike was very surgical and went for a Hamas target because Israel is at war. Whoever did this has a gripe with Hamas. It's, once again, whoever did this, it's not an attack on the Lebanese state. It's not an attack on the Hezbollah terrorist organization. Whoever did this, it's an attack on Hamas. That's very clear.
This comes as a full Israeli cabinet meeting set for this afternoon was postponed. It was set to discuss what happens in Gaza the day after Hamas is destroyed and how long an Israeli occupation might last. An Israeli official outlined details of the government's current proposal to NBC News. In it, Israel retains, quote, security responsibility for the foreseeable future and establishes a temporary security zone on Gaza's perimeter, though it's unclear if that would be on Israeli or on Palestinian land. It also includes an inspection mechanism controlled by Israel on the Gaza side for goods entering on the Egypt-Gaza border. And finally, Israel expects local clans to handle administrative needs for civilians, including humanitarian aid. The plan notably does not include the Palestinian Authority, who the U.S. has repeatedly said should be revitalized and have a role in Gaza's governance. Reacting to the reporting, a U.S. official tells NBC that any day-after scenario must focus on stability and on humanitarian aid, and that they've had, quote, constructive discussions about this with the Israelis. It comes as Secretary Blinken is expected to visit Israel for the 5th time later this month, and as the U.S. continues to pressure Israel to do more to protect civilians. Heavy fighting and airstrikes have continued in central Gaza. And as the humanitarian crisis deteriorates, the UN is warning about the increased risk that fatal diseases will spread among the displaced civilian population. Here to report on all of this is NBC's Matt Bradley in Tel Aviv and former NBC News Tel Aviv bureau chief Martin Fletcher. So, Matt, I'll start with you. Hamas says a senior official was killed, and this is in Lebanon, and what they say was an Israeli airstrike. You heard Mark Regev there go to great lengths to say it's not an Israeli airstrike, or at least Israel isn't claiming it. What more do we know about what happened here and the cross-border tensions now between Israel and Lebanon?
Yeah, well, you heard Mark Regev himself kind of saying it was Israel and then sort of backtracking in that sort of awkward sort of jumble he had there. That was a little bit interesting and revealing. Look, we don't know if Israel did this for sure, but we have a very informed speculation that it was, in fact, Israel. And so we can kind of make an informed assumption that it was, and we don't expect that Israel will necessarily acknowledge responsibility for this. But the fact is, as Mark Regev really stumbled on himself saying, it was somebody who had a gripe with Hamas and not with Hezbollah, and that was revealing in its own way. It goes to show that Israel is still trying to avoid an all-out war with Hezbollah, which would be disastrous, not just for the Israelis and the Israeli military, but also for the people of Lebanon, who cannot afford another full-on war with the Israelis Israelis and Hezbollah themselves, the population of Lebanon might not forgive them. Nobody really wants to see an all-out war breaking out over that border, which was why this was such a risky and inflammatory move by the Israelis. Yes, they took out Hamas's second in command, but at what cost? The fact is they came and may still be going very, very close to the precipice of an all-out war with Hezbollah. That could drag in Iran, the United States, the Houthis, as we've seen over the past several months. All of that action, all of that fighting, including the lethal events that we saw with the U.S. sunk 3 Houthi ships and killed 10 Houthi fighters. All of this just takes one foul step, one misplaced foot to set the whole region off. And that's what Israel risks when they do these coordinated assassinations. If it was indeed Israel, and again, we can use some informed speculation there, they risk when they make those attacks in Beirut, in Hezbollah territory, in Dahia, a suburb that is known as a stronghold of Hezbollah, attacking a man, Salah al-Aruri, who was seen as the main connective tissue between Hamas and Hezbollah. So this was a very inflammatory move.
And Matt, what else can you tell us about what we're learning about this day after plan for Gaza and the Israeli cabinet meeting today that wasn't?
Well, I can just tell you what my excellent colleague Josh Lederman got, and that was the information that you were just saying just now. He's the one who got that from Israeli officials, including that this meeting was now going to be postponed. I mean, the fact is that the Israelis this was kind of the missing piece here. This was always the question that everybody had, because while the Israelis have said that they are going to be launching and have been launching a muscular, lethal war that many in the world, not the United States, have referred to as genocidal, because now we're seeing more than 22,000 Palestinians who've been killed in the Gaza Strip ever since October 7th. This is something that lacked an end game, and that was something that U.S. officials were always very alarmed about. What is a victory in the Gaza Strip? What does that look like? What does it mean for this war to end? That has to have an exit strategy, which is a term that we as Americans, when we talk about the Middle East, we know this term very, very well. Exit strategy was always the missing piece for a lot of American adventures in the Middle East over the past 2 decades. So this is something that might actually be coming to fruition. It's something that it shows, at least, even though this meeting was postponed, that the Israelis are thinking about the fact that they're eliminating the idea of the Palestinian Authority maybe taking over control of the Gaza Strip. Well, that's kind of practical. The fact is that the Israelis don't want that. The Netanyahu government doesn't want the Palestinian Authority to do that. The fact is a lot of Palestinians don't want to see the Palestinian Authority taking control over the Gaza Strip. They trust the Palestinian Authority in many ways, and you can see this in a lot of polling recently. They trust the Palestinian Authority less than they trust Hamas, the group that started all of this. So, there's not a lot of lost love for the Palestinian Authority. It's not necessarily surprising that the Israelis are going to be looking at some other way of stewarding the Gaza Strip after this is all finished.
No, that's excellent context. Matt Bradley for us in Tel Aviv. Matt, thank you. Martin, I'll bring you in here now as somebody who covered some of those American wars in the Middle East and knows Israel better than anybody. What's your reaction to this outline of an exit strategy that we're learning about today?
Well, what interested me most, Garrett, was I think we've heard the first 3 points. We've been hearing that all the time.
Right.
But the idea that that Israel would encourage local family clans to step up and take control of different areas of the Gaza Strip, obviously the areas of which their families are based. That's not a recipe for peace within Gaza. There's going to be so much conflict, so many, if it ever happens, so many different groups in control of different areas, presumably coordinating with the Israeli military, which will not endear the clans with many of the residents of Hamas. And by the way, it's an idea that has come up many times in the past, not only in Gaza but in the West Bank. At one point, Israel encouraged what they called them the village leagues. That's right, the village leagues. There's basically the same idea in the West Bank. Village leagues in the West Bank meant they were going to get families in the West Bank in different areas who would control those areas, basically working on behalf of the Israeli security services and government to keep the peace in that territory. Well, it didn't work. There was a lot of infighting amongst the clans, and as I mentioned that possibility earlier, there was a lot of a lot of speculation that they were just tools of the Israeli government. So that's what would happen in the Gaza Strip if clans took over. So it's just it's an idea that has been around for a long time. It hasn't worked in the past in the West Bank. It's unlikely to work in Gaza. It's a way for the Prime Minister Netanyahu and his supporters to say, look, we're not going to allow the Palestinian Authority to take control in the West Bank. We don't trust them. They're corrupt. They don't want real peace with Israel. And so this is an alternative option to present to the Palestinians, to the Israelis, and especially to the American government, because President Biden is one of the key proponents of the idea of the Palestinian Authority taking control in Gaza.
Well, you got where I wanted to go on this, Martin, too, because it also seems totally incongruent with the idea of a two-state solution. Breaking up Gaza into smaller governmental units doesn't seem to work, which is what the Biden administration has said it ultimately wants, which is a two-state solution here.
Well, that's right. I mean, look, a two-state solution has always been the only game in town, realistically.
Netanyahu doesn't agree.
No, well, actually, the official Israeli government position has always been, and under Prime Minister Netanyahu, a two-state solution. That was the official Israeli government position. Since October 7, they said, no, it can't work. So the question is, can it work when tempests have calmed down, when the fighting is over? I know I'm speculating, maybe naively, that it could happen quite soon, but probably within the year 2024, of course, it's many months away, the fighting will tamper down. There'll be pressure for a peaceful way forward, negotiations which America will insist upon, and hopefully the Arab countries will insist Hamas either takes part in or is removed from the scene altogether. So a two-state solution, although it doesn't seem likely now, obviously, it's still the only real way forward.
All right, Martin Fletcher, we will be talking about this for quite a long time, I imagine. Thank you for joining us. And joining me now is retired Admiral James Stavridis, former NATO Supreme Allied Commander. He's now NBC News Chief International Analyst. And as our designated military officer here, let's talk first about this strike on a senior Hamas official in Beirut. Israel's not commenting yet, but is there anyone other than Israel or the IDF who could have conducted this strike? And what do you make of the way in which they're trying to keep some distance from it, given the political tinderbox there, as Matt Bradley described?
First, in terms of capacity to conduct the strike, there are numerous countries that could have done it. But, you know, cui bono, who does it benefit? Right. It benefits the Israelis to kill him, and they did so, almost certainly. Hard to imagine anybody else. I think they're distancing themselves simply to try and keep from inflaming what is already going to be an inflammatory situation. Let's look at it this way. At the start of this sequence, say October 7th, I thought the chances of a wider war were really pretty low, about 10%. Now I think they're up to about 30%. The reason I am more concerned about a wider war is this kind of incident, probably going to be followed up by something in Doha, where a number of other senior Hamas leaders live.
Wait, you think there could be violence in Doha? That seems to me like that would be incredibly inflammatory.
Yeah, it would be. But if you're an Israeli and you watched your wives and your daughters and your children killed and raped and tortured, there's really nothing off limits right now. I think it's unlikely they go to Doha, but not impossible. Anyway, my point, broadly speaking, Jared, is just that the tensions are rising. It's a more significant risk of a wider war. That is certainly the aftermath of this strike.
What do you make of this day after planning that we're finally starting to see from Israel now several months into this war? The political decentralization that Martin and I were just talking about, but also the kind of security systems that need to be in place before anything like this could work.
I am with Martin that the idea of local clans taking step seems far-fetched to me. There just are no good options here. Certainly from the perspective of the Israelis. One thing I would almost certainly say is Hamas will not be part of the governance structure going forward. Israel will not allow that. It's simply going to be a red line for the reasons we talked about a moment ago. I think anything else could be considered. Could it be a mix of Palestinian Authority, Arab League, I think is a group not often mentioned that would have capacity, capability, notably Egypt and Jordan, who do have diplomatic relations with Israel, UN peacekeeping force, some combination of those I think is possible. I think the one thing that will not be part of a post-conflict structure is Hamas.
And Admiral, while I have you, let's talk about what's been going on in the Red Sea. We saw some significant retaliation by U.S. forces against these Houthi boats the other day. Now Iran is sending its own naval vessel into that body. What do you make of the chance of escalation, accidental or otherwise, in the Red Sea?
Yeah, this is exactly why I think the chances of a wider war are expanding, because it's not just what's happening in Gaza. It's what's happening on the northern border of Israel with Hezbollah plinking rockets. They fired 1,000 rockets from the north. It's also what's happening ashore in Iraq and Syria, where Iranian proxies are attacking U.S. forces. And now, as you correctly point out, these Houthi rebels, I like to call them Iranian pirates because that's what they really are attacking merchant shipping. And all of that increases tensions. Look, those destroyers can take care of themselves, but these merchant ships are largely defenseless. And if we want the global supply chains to work, we better make sure you can get through the Red Sea, because at the north is the Suez Canal. If that's shut down, it blocks up 15% of the world's goods traveling on the oceans. I think you're going to see the U.S. be forced to go ashore and strike at these Houthi camps if they don't stop firing missiles at our warships and at merchant ships.
Admiral James Stavridis, an expert on a dangerous world. Thank you for coming on with us today. And
My
coming
pleasure,
up,
Garrett.
Coming up, countdown to Decision Day. We're on the trail in Iowa and New Hampshire, talking to voters and candidates as the Republican primary field makes their final push to the finish line. But first, a shocking accident on an airport tarmac in Japan, hours after the strongest earthquake in more than a decade struck the nation, killing dozens. We're on the ground in Tokyo next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. Today, the death toll from a series of earthquakes that hit Japan on Monday has risen to at least 55 as search and rescue teams move into the areas most affected. That death toll does not include 5 crew members on the Japanese Coast Guard plane who died in a catastrophic collision with a passenger jet at a Tokyo airport on Tuesday. Dramatic video from the scene shows the moment the passenger plane burst into flames after impact. The Coast Guard plane that struck it was set to fly earthquake relief to the country's west coast. Now, the passenger jet was carrying more than 350 passengers and crew, and everyone was able to evacuate before the aircraft was completely consumed with flames, as you can see from this striking footage from the tarmac. Journalist Kaori Njoji is reporting on this story for us from Tokyo, Japan. And Kaori, let's start with that plane collision between the passenger jet and the Coast Guard plane earlier this morning. What more do we know about how this happened?
Well, they're telling us, Japan Airlines is saying that their pilot, who was piloting this domestic flight that was about to land at Haneda Airport, they got the go-ahead to land, and as they were making that landing, or shortly thereafter, it seems to have collided with a Coast Guard, much smaller plane that was carrying 6 people. Now, Japan Airlines and the Transportation Ministry officials are not saying anything to us beyond that, saying that this is an ongoing investigation that has just begun. But we saw those horrific pictures of the Airbus plane erupting into flames, skidding down the runway to a point that you couldn't really even tell that it was an aircraft anymore. It took more than 70 firefighters to put out those flames. It took about 6 hours, and miraculously, 379 people on board, including the crew, and 8 small children were evacuated safely. However, 5 people on that Coast Guard plane are dead, and the one captain who escaped the aircraft is in serious condition. And as you pointed out, this aircraft was getting ready to take off to bring supplies to the earthquake-stricken area, and so this has been really one tragedy after another this New Year holidays here.
And talking about the earthquake, the number of fatalities reported today, I think we're now up to 55. What's the status of search and rescue operations? Do we expect that number to continue to rise as rescuers get to more of these areas that were affected?
Unfortunately, the fear is that the death toll may increase. One of the reasons for that is that there are people still trapped under the rubble. Some officials say that may be more than 100 people. Access to some of these areas are it's in a remote area in central Japan on the western coast facing the Sea of Japan, and access originally was very difficult, but now even more so because some of the roads have been blocked off because of landslides. You're seeing fissures in the road that make it extremely dangerous to navigate around there. Some roads you can see undulation, which happens when a huge earthquake strikes. It basically pushes the earth up and creates kind of a liquefied effect on the road. You're seeing rescue efforts on the ground, through the sea, via helicopter as well, but you also have to remember that there are aftershocks continuing as we speak. So for the thousands of people that are still in evacuation centers, many without water and electricity, it has been a very, very traumatic 2 years, and many people across the country are being forced to relive the memories of 2011, that devastating earthquake that Japan faced then. So we have very, very difficult conditions still.
All right, Kaora and Joji, thank you for that reporting. And up next, we are live in the Granite State, 3 weeks out from the First in the Nation primary, with an inside look at what independents, one of New Hampshire's most critical voting blocs, are saying about the candidates in this final push. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. With the Iowa caucuses now less than 2 weeks away, Vivek Ramaswamy is making clear how important the Hawkeye state is to his campaign. The Republican candidate is completing his second full Grassley today. That means he'll have visited all 99 counties in Iowa twice. Ramaswamy is the only GOP candidate on the campaign trail in Iowa today. Ron DeSantis hits the Hawkeye state tomorrow. Iowa could be a do-or-die contest for him, too. He spent New Year's Eve and New Year's Day campaigning in-state. Nikki Haley, meanwhile, will hold a town hall this evening in New Hampshire, a state she's made one of, if not her key focus in her campaign. It's also a state in which about 40% of the electorate is undeclared, not a member of any political party. Haley, Ramaswamy, and DeSantis are all scrambling to make this primary contest into an actual contest against frontrunner Donald Trump. NBC News correspondent Mara Barrett joins me now from Dubuque, Iowa. And joining me from Heye, New Hampshire is NBC News campaign embed Emma Barnett. So, Mara, I'll start with you. Vivek Ramaswamy, the only candidate on the trail in Iowa today, he seems to be trying to make himself omnipresent and inescapable in the state.
That's definitely for sure, with 6 events on his schedule here today, Garrett. And it's notable that he's hitting that double Grassley, essentially going through those 99 counties twice. But he's taking full advantage of the fact that he is surprisingly the only candidate here, something that I was pretty shocked by given the crunch time situation that we're in. But when you look at the difference between Vivek Ramaswamy and how he's come out as more of an extreme right candidate compared to a Ron DeSantis or a Nikki Haley, the voters that are going to DeSantis and Haley's events are really looking to see who they want to choose as an alternative to Trump a lot of the time, whereas voters that I've met at Ramaswamy events today have talked about how they want to choose between former President Trump and Ramaswamy. And so they've seen a lot of similarities, but they see him as a younger alternative potentially. And so Ramaswamy really trying to harness on those connections that he's making in real time, in person with voters today, while other candidates have really been capitalizing on that $105 million we've seen invested in ads on the airwaves leading up to the caucus. But that presence will change very rapidly in the next couple of days.
What's the Ramaswamy play post-Iowa? I mean, if he's all that time he's spending there, he's not spending in New Hampshire or South Carolina or nationally.
That's a very good point, and it's noted here on the ground, too, given that a lot of his team lives here. He's got a way larger ground game here, a smaller staff in New Hampshire, and he really hasn't traveled outside of the state in several weeks. He won't be going back to New Hampshire until after the caucuses are wrapped up here, and so he's really putting all of his eggs in the Iowa basket, as you could say. I want you to hear a little bit of, we just had a conversation with him as he wrapped up an event here in Dubuque just last hour about how he thinks he's going to perform in the next 13 days on Iowa Caucus Day.
I think that we expect to be in the top three. I think we have a good shot at winning the Iowa caucus, but we don't need to win the Iowa caucus for me to have a full and clear path to going all the way in the long distance. But I think it is to significantly exceed the expectations that have been set for us, as I expect we will.
A classically optimistic candidate, as we've obviously seen in the past. Garrett, a reminder that when you look at polling, he is in single digits, while Donald Trump is obviously ahead by double digits. DeSantis and Haley kind of fighting for that second place spot here in Iowa.
All right, Mara Barrett in Iowa for us. Emma, you're over in New Hampshire right now, where the voters like to take whatever Iowa did and just throw it out the window and do their own thing. What are you hearing from the undeclared voters who you're speaking to in the Granite State?
That's exactly right, Garrett. And the voters in Iowa and the voters in New Hampshire couldn't be more different. And that's partially because in New Hampshire, 40% of the electorate are these undeclared voters. That means they get to choose whether to vote in the Democratic or Republican primary. There's a bit of an inside joke here in the state where you have to shake a candidate's hand at least 3 times before you even consider voting for them. Now, I spoke to these 3 independent ladies here in New Hampshire. They're undeclared voters, and they've been to dozens of town halls, and they've basically made up their minds. So I know you ladies have a group chat, but is there a name?
Oh, well, we like to think of ourselves as the First in the Nation friends, because that's how we became friends. If it wasn't for the First in the Nation primary, we wouldn't have met.
First in the Nation. These 3 women have become close friends, participating in what New Hampshire's known for, politics. What makes the First in the Nation primary so special?
The incredible access to the candidates. When the candidates recognize you, you know that you've been to a lot of their events.
Marie, Thalia, and Hella have attended dozens of town halls similar to this one, where they get to meet presidential candidates face to face. They know how consequential this election is, and they take their role as early primary voters very seriously. That's why all these ladies are registered as undeclared voters in the state, meaning they can choose to vote in the Democratic or Republican primary. Thalia and Hella just changed their registration from Democrat to undeclared this cycle.
The whole point was to stop Trump and make sure he's not the nominee. So that was the impetus for changing my affiliation.
Is this your first time voting in a Republican primary in the state?
Yes. Yep.
Of course, they're 3 of many voters, but their mentality is similar to a lot of others I've talked to in the state. The big question is, do their views signal a broader trend, a potential liability for the former president and current frontrunner?
If you don't get out and vote, we can put this to bed.
The polls show Trump miles ahead of Nikki Haley, Christie, everyone else in the field right now. Do you believe that to be an accurate reflection of what you're hearing and seeing on the ground among your friends in New Hampshire?
No. I think Nikki Haley is going to perform a lot better in New Hampshire than the polls are showing. A lot of independents are going to come out.
A good percentage of the voters that are undecided, they make up their minds when they're in the voting booth, like right then and there.
So here's the big question. Who are you going to vote for in the primary?
I am heavily leaning towards Nikki Haley.
Likewise.
Ditto.
All Nikki Haley?
Yep.
100% or?
No, it's New Hampshire. It's never New Hampshire.
If you told me a year ago that I would even be considering Nikki Haley, or Chris Christie for that matter, I would tell you were crazy.
So what was it that changed for you?
Going to the town halls, meeting the people in person and actually listening to them.
The candidates' answers to questions at town halls can really swing votes.
What do you want me to say about slavery?
Case in point, this viral moment. Will Nikki Haley lose support after not mentioning slavery in a question about what caused the Civil War? She has since walked back the comments. The 3 women tell me her answer disappointed them. They're still leaning towards Haley, but in the Granite State, nothing is set in stone. How powerful is the independent vote in New Hampshire?
It's extremely powerful. The question is getting them out to vote.
Do you think the fact that Trump is on the ballot again is a motivator to get independent voters showing up in big numbers on January 23rd?
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, that's critical.
So as you heard there, Garrett, these voters have basically made up their minds. They're probably going to be voting for Nikki Haley, but it's not said and done until they're in the voting booth and they click that button. Now, what's really interesting is in a hypothetical matchup between Nikki Haley and Joe Biden, 2 of these 3 voters said that they would vote for Nikki Haley, even though they tend to lean a little bit more to the Democrat side of things. And that reflects a lot of the polling that we've been seeing in these hypothetical matchups between Nikki Haley and the president. Garrett?
Fascinating stuff. Emma Barnett on the trail in New Hampshire. Thank you for that. And after the break, Ivy League shakeup. The president of Harvard resigns, the second Ivy League president to step down following testimony before Congress on the issue of anti-Semitism. What it says about the state of higher education, U.S. politics, and the cascading fallout of the war in the Middle East. The panel is next. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. This afternoon, a new development in a story we followed closely last year. Harvard President Claudine Gay, the first black leader of the nearly 400-year-old university, announcing her resignation just 6 months into her tenure after new allegations of plagiarism surfaced yesterday. This comes after a set of compounding controversies, most notably backlash to her testimony before Congress last month, where she, along with other Ivy League presidents, appeared to sidestep the question of whether students calling for the genocide of the Jewish people was a violation of university policies. Gay's resignation comes after University of Pennsylvania President Liz McGill resigned last month. MIT President Sally Kornbluth, who also testified, remains in her post. Republican Congresswoman Elise Stefanik, who questioned the university presidents in those hearings, reacting to the news on X with, quote, 2 down. Joining me now, Tia Mitchell, Washington correspondent at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, Symone Sanders, host of MSNBC's Symone, and starting January 13th, co-host of The Weekend, and Republican strategist and former RNC communications director and fan of the artist The Weeknd, Doug Heye.
That's true.
I believe it. Who isn't? Tia, I'll start with you. What's your reaction to this news out of Harvard? These resignations seemed like it might have been a fait accompli. Was this really about plagiarism, or was this about more than that?
Well, it's definitely about more than that. And it, quite frankly, is probably about more than just the hearing on Capitol Hill. There was some misgivings about President Gay all along, quite frankly, that, of course, her backers said that was rooted in sexism and racism and not giving her her due as Harvard's first black president. But there were some people who were uncomfortable about her from the beginning, if we're going to be honest. And then the pile on after the hearing, the culture wars that have been taken to our nation's universities, quite frankly, it all plays in together. And ultimately, she decided it was best to go.
Doug, I feel like this is a big story on the right. Yeah. You know, it's the culture wars. It's, you know, elite institutions on the East Coast. Is this going to resonate in the broader public? I don't have a good handle on it.
No, I don't think it will, but it's still an important thing. And I'll tell you, when I watched that hearing, Claudine Gay was the worst witness that I've seen in a congressional testimony, and that includes the one that I worked on in the House of Agriculture Committee that had cockfighters in it, right? That's how bad she was at that hearing. And then you compound upon that issues of plagiarism. And what we know about plagiarism is when one instant comes, then there come 2 and 3 and 4, which is what we saw here. But I'm not concerned about Claudine Gay. I'm concerned about Jewish kids on college campuses. I'm on the Board of Visitors for North Carolina. I was on our campus at a Board of Visitors meeting the week after North Carolina had similar protests that used images of the gliders and things like that. My school was unprepared to talk about this. I think whether you're Harvard, MIT, Penn, North Carolina, any school, you better be prepared to have real answers on how kids are going to feel safe on their own campuses.
Yeah, I mean, the gotcha mentality here from Elise Stefanik seems to sort of miss the broader point.
I think the gotcha mentality, though, is in fact the point. Let's just be very clear. The testimony from the presidents, horrific. So they're horrific. It was absolutely terrible. They answered a human question with an academic answer that they were prepped by their universities, quite frankly, to give. So that's
and law firms.
And law firms,
terrible
okay?
Staff work
terrible staff work, okay, across the board. But on top of that, what happened in the aftermath of that, particularly as it relates to Dr. Gay, the calls came and said she was terrible in this hearing and she's unqualified. In 387 years, only 2 women have been president of Harvard University. The first woman was before Claudine Gay. Only 1 black woman has been president. And that black woman now, 6 months after, has resigned from her job because, and look at the statement, it's in the best interest of Harvard to resign so the community can navigate with focus on the institution rather than an individual. Harvard decided that it was unable to continue to weather the storm. And while I don't think the culture wars, frankly, that play out on campuses across the country will eventually have the biggest effect in general come 2024. What will have an effect, as Doug said, is how Jewish students feel on college campuses, how Arab American students feel on college campuses, and how every black professional in America can turn on their television today, see this news about Dr. Claudine Gay, and all have the same reaction. It looks as though she was targeted.
It's interesting stuff.
But you said she was horrific, and then we had a series of scandals. She then targeted herself. Again, she was worse than cockfighters in testifying before Congress.
Yeah, I mean,
that's a low bar.
I guess I will just say this, is that, you know, again, 387 years, much like when we talked about classified documents with former presidents and vice presidents, and I have said, you know, there's no protocol in which to pack up a president or vice president leaves office. And I think if you go to any home of a former president or vice president, you might accidentally find a classified document or two. Not necessarily nuclear secrets, but, you know, maybe a piece of paper that they shouldn't have took out. Same thing. Look at what other presidents of Harvard have been investigated for plagiarism. And if we want to be very specific, which I think we should, the issues of plagiarism, it is loose citations. Again, not something I would want to do, but all I'm saying
some of it was loose citations. Some of it was pure old-fashioned plagiarism.
I think this illustrates the emotions around
this issue. Which is why this is going to be an issue. I do think this is a race issue just as much as it is an issue about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia.
I don't disagree, but in fact, this is not the only.
We agree that this is more important than Claudine Gay. This is about students on campus being safe.
I'm glad we've established this point, but I don't think the firing or the resignation of Harvard's president will be the only issue that are on people's minds, and I want to make sure we get to a couple of others because the president is now coming back from his vacation, and Tia, he has a lot on his plate. A week or so in the sun in St. Croix did not get rid of the hot wars he's facing, the negotiations going on Capitol Hill. How big is the first month of this new year for this president?
It's going to be big, and you can't put it all on President Biden. He can't make Congress pass appropriations bills. He can't make Congress fund the wars in Ukraine or fund aid to Israel. He can't make Congress put together a border policy package, which he said, hey, I'm ready. Send me something that I can sign. He can't do it himself. Congress has to do it. So there are going to be a lot of headaches for the president because of the gridlock over here at the Capitol. And that's where, I mean, ideally, there is so much on Congress's plate, which is why going after presidents of universities does seem like not the highest and best use of their time. When we are looking at a government shutdown deadline mid-January, we are looking at the wars in Ukraine and the Israel-Hamas conflict, quite frankly, ramping up. And the Israel-Hamas conflict is possibly going to become a regional conflict if diplomacy isn't able to work that out. Those are the things on Biden's plate.
So, Doug, if President Biden can't force Congress to do these things, can Speaker Mike Johnston? His majority got smaller over the break. Are we about to see him get tested in a very major way here?
I think so, and his majority is going to continue to get smaller. We have resignations that we know are coming for later this month, and we know that we start with the deadline of the first tranche of funding that comes in the middle of the month. I think everybody knows this is going to be a very difficult January in Washington. And then you add the Iowa caucus, the New Hampshire primary to it. This is going to be a very difficult month in politics, period. That starts with Joe Biden, but that sure includes House Republicans as well.
As a veteran of this administration, what do the conversations look like right now as the White House is trying to figure out how to kind of wrestle control of these issues, even the ones that they can't force through, as Tia was just describing?
Well, I think one of the chief conversations is who is their best and who can they negotiate with. Speaker McCarthy and President Biden did negotiate a deal initially that McCarthy walked away from, and now we have Speaker Mike Johnston, whom we have yet to see a test of his ability to corral his caucus. If Speaker McCarthy couldn't do it, I am hard-pressed to believe that Mike Johnston has the depth to be able to pull it together. So who the White House can negotiate with in Congress is very important. On top of that, I do think also, though, that they're dealing with the fact that they've got Democrats who also are quite vocal. Tim Kaine was not pleased that the White House bypassed the administration bypassed Congress and sent aid to Israel. Who is not pleased about aid to Israel is Bernie Sanders, who is now saying he's not going to vote for a bill. Those are all people you got to talk to if you want to get anything done.
Can they negotiate with James Lankford? He's the point person on this border negotiations, which seems to be the thing that has the most moving parts, if not the most likely issue to get solved.
I think so. Look, I think in the lead up to the holiday, there were aggressive negotiations happening up until the last flight that folks could take out. And I think with maybe another week and a half or so, there's going to be some kind of deal on the border. The question is it a deal that Democrats writ large in the House of Representatives specifically are going to back?
It's going to be interesting, but we got to leave it there. Simone, Doug, and Tia, thank you all. And still to come, Pushed to the Brink. My one-on-one interview with the mayor of Denver is next. He's joining a growing number of Democratic mayors calling on the federal government to step in and help with the mounting migrant crisis in major U.S. cities. You're watching Meet the Press Now. Welcome back. We're following some breaking news now. Donald Trump's campaign has just officially appealed the Maine Secretary of State's decision to disqualify him from that state's primary ballot. The Secretary of State made that decision last Thursday, declaring Mr. Trump ineligible because of the 14th Amendment, which prohibits anyone who engaged in insurrection from holding office. We're still expecting the former president to appeal a similar decision from Colorado's Supreme Court to the U.S. Supreme Court. We'll obviously bring you that news if and when we get it. But turning now to the crisis at the southern border. Customs and Border Protection reported a record number of border crossings last month, just about 300,000 migrants, with the influx ratcheting up pressure on cities all across the country. But as major metropolises from New York to Denver and beyond, calling for more help from the federal government to help them house and shelter everyone who's coming. Julia Ainsley's been covering the emergency at the border for NBC News and joins me now. So I want to start with this SB 4 in Texas, because I think that's part of what is fueling Abbott and Texas to start moving these people to other cities. Explain that policy and why it is so controversial and at the root of this issue right now.
Well, it would allow Texas law enforcement to arrest any migrants or anyone who they suspect to have come into the country illegally as an immigrant, and it allows state judges in Texas to order these people to be deported. It's a radical departure from the way we've historically handled immigration at the federal level in this country. But DOJ actually had to wait a little while because they want to see who this is going to harm. They knew that would be key to any legal challenge to this. And so even though the Texas governor signed this into law a few weeks ago, they're now threatening to sue if he does not confirm that he won't enforce it. It's a little different than the way we saw things with razor wire and buoys, where you could point to something and say, there's the policy, there it is in action. This is taking a little longer because they want to find someone who could be affected. They're actually going a bit faster here to say that unless Abbott says he won't enforce this law, which doesn't seem likely.
Tell me you won't enforce this law.
Tell me you won't do this.
Yeah.
It's just their way of speeding up the clock, and honestly, it could go up to the Supreme Court, just like we saw the Justice Department take the razor wire issue to the Supreme Court today.
So what are we going to see from the federal government here in the intervening months? Let's assume it takes some time for there to be any border negotiations that are successful, if there are any at all. Are there still arrows in the Biden administration's quiver to address this migrant crisis?
You know, that's a big question, and I think what I'm hearing is a lot of it comes down to Mexico. As you know, Secretaries Mayorkas, Blinken just went down to Mexico to meet with those officials. I don't think people realize how much immigration policy and how much happens on the border really gets down to what Mexico is willing to do. So I think there's a lot of diplomacy that they're trying to forge with Mexico, try to get them to stop more people on their way to the United States. Mexico may be willing to play ball to some degree, but they've already really spent a whole lot of capital on things like Remain in Mexico and Title 42. And then we could see, are there ways that they will make asylum restrictions stricter, even without Congress stepping in?
Not a lot of coverage after the fact on that meeting down in Mexico. It'll be interesting to see what, if anything, we learn about what came out of it. Julia Ainsley, thank you for that. And joining me now is Denver Mayor Mike Johnston. Mr. Mayor, thank you for being with us. And my first question is, what resources, just generally, do you feel like you need from the federal government right now amid this surge in migrants?
Yeah, I really appreciate it. I mean, I think we have been pushing really hard that there are three key items we need right now. We definitely need the Congress to take action on $1 for support for cities. That's key. I think the second is we need more work authorization for folks that are arriving to our cities. The biggest issue is we have folks here who want to work and are not able to work. And the third is we need their help on a plan for coordinated entry. So we don't have just the governor of one state deciding where all newcomers go, but actually a coordinated plan nationwide for all of our cities and states to be a part of the solution. And we think those three things can actually help us be very successful. We just need those three things from Congress to be able to succeed here at the city level.
You've been pushing on the issue of work authorization specifically for some time now. You asked the White House last month for more authorizations. Have you gotten any response from the Biden administration or any indication that increased authorizations might be part of the negotiations that are going on in D.C. around this border issue?
We're working hard at it. I think they understand it and see it. I met with Secretary Mayorkas months ago, and that was before he then took the step to grant temporary protective status for Venezuelans that came before July 31. That was a tremendous help for many of our Venezuelan newcomers who arrived in August and September. The challenge is now, we have 4,500 migrants in shelter tonight in Denver. We are the single largest recipient of migrants per capita of any city in America. And almost all those folks that have arrived now don't have access to that temporary protective status. So they don't have a clear path to work authorization. That makes it harder and harder for us to help them. And every time I see folks, they ask me the same thing, which is just, how can I get a job? All I need is access to work. And so we're optimistic that that's making progress. And we think should be an area of bipartisan support. Nothing more un-American than having someone come to the country and telling them they can't work to support themselves once they get here. So we think whatever Congress decides is their admission policy, that's got to come with clear and immediate access to work once they arrive.
We had the mayor of Houston on just before Christmas. We've had a lot of mayors who've been talking about this issue publicly. I'm curious what the conversations are like behind the scenes, the contact you have with your fellow big city mayors, all of you trying to address this issue from slightly different perspectives all around the country.
Yeah, there's a lot of conversation and partnership. Obviously, right now, Chicago and New York and Denver together, we've accepted more than 200,000 migrants. So we are the great majority of all of the incoming traffic right now. So we have been in regular contact. But I've also been in a lot of contact with other mayors from other cities, some of whom have less inflow of migrants right now and are willing to be a part of the coalition to find a better solution. So I think when you're a city mayor, you're nonpartisan. You don't have a flag in the ideological battle in D.C. You just want to be able to run your city effectively. And what we need really is this work authorization plus resources and a coordinated plan. And we think that gets us a long way towards a successful strategy.
But my understanding is this has become something of a political fight in Colorado, where you've had some of the surrounding counties and communities very concerned about how Denver is handling this. Does the governor step in that situation? I mean, talk to me about how this is working in your region, in your broader community.
The governor has been a great support for us, so we're lucky to have Governor Polis, and his team has done a fantastic job to help us with resources and other supports. But we do know this is a regional issue. I mean, the major reason we're the top recipient for migrants right now is because we are the shortest and cheapest bus ticket north of El Paso. You come straight north on I-25 from El Paso, Denver is the first big city you hit. And so we think this does need to be a regional solution. We're talking to mayors around the region, and frankly, we're hitting a point where there's not much else we can do. We have almost filled every single available hotel room in the city and county of Denver. And so we're over 4,500 migrants in shelter tonight. If that number continues to rise, we just wouldn't have the capacity in Denver to support it. So we are reaching out beyond our borders. And we know people have questions and concerns, but I think they also don't want to see families and kids homeless in the streets of our cities. And so we want to make sure we find a solution that can avoid that.
Well, to that end, you've said you've not considered turning away any of these buses of migrants that are coming to your city. But is there a point at which that's something Denver might have to do, or something you might have to consider?
Yeah, we're going to hit a capacity at which we just won't be able anymore to manage the amount of inflow. And so we're trying to avoid that problem. But we know we can't keep growing at this pace. When I took the oath of office 6 months ago, we had about 400 migrants in shelter. We are more than 10 times that number right now. We've brought 35,000 through this year, and remarkably been able to get 99% of them up and placed into housing or work or onward travel. And so we have been very successful, but now we're hitting a breaking point at which there's just not enough volume of work or of housing in the city to support this ongoing volume. Not to mention the impact on city budgets. This could be $160 or $180 million of impact on our budget next year. That's almost 15% of the entire city budget. So those are numbers we certainly couldn't accommodate on our own without real help.
And to that end, I mean, New York City's mayor, Eric Adams, they've been getting hammered by this. He told a reporter recently, he said something to the effect of, not everyone that's coming into this country is pursuing the American dream. It sounded somewhat Trumpian. I mean, I wonder how you feel like, does that narrative kind of play into the anti-immigrant argument that we're hearing from Donald Trump and some of his supporters? How do you view that?
I mean, the thing that actually gives me hope about this scenario is that every day it's quite clear to me there is a path to solve it. I mean, when I talk to migrants every single day, all they say is, thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't need help or charity. All I want is a job. At the same time, I get calls every day from employers and CEOs who say, hey, Mike, I hear there are a bunch of migrants just arrived. I want to hire them. Can I please hire them? So we have people here who desperately want to work. We have employers here who definitely want to hire them. We have a federal government that stands in the way of our ability to get them hired. I talked to a migrant on Friday who is here on an asylum claim, and that asylum claim is set to be adjudicated right now in the year 2029. And so that is not a path to success for him or for our city, but they do desperately want to work. We just want to give them the chance to get to work.
All right, a message from the middle of the country to Washington. Help us get these people to work. Mayor Mike Johnston, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Have a great day.
And thank you all for being with us this hour. We're back tomorrow with more Meet the Press Now. NBC News Now coverage continues with Heye Jackson right now.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.